But in 1945, the US Army had a crisis they couldn't solve. Mountains of undelivered mail. 17 million pieces. Letters from mothers who didn't know if their sons were alive. Care packages rotting in warehouses. Soldiers going years without hearing from home. The Army looked at this disaster and saw an impossible mission. So they handed it to 855 black women, gave them the worst conditions imaginable, and expected them to fail. What happened next would expose every lie the military told about who could do the impossible work. And for 77 years, they made sure you never heard this story. Picture the scene in Birmingham, England, February 1945. 6 massive warehouses, mail stacked from floor to ceiling, some of it 3 years old. Soldiers are fighting across Europe, and they haven't heard from their families in months, sometimes years. Morale is collapsing. The Army calls it a crisis, but here's what they don't tell you. They had already tried to fix this. They failed. White male units looked at the job and couldn't figure it out. The system was overwhelmed. 17 million pieces of mail with no organization, no tracking system, just chaos. Letters with incomplete addresses, packages for men who had been transferred 5 times. 7,500 soldiers with the same name, Robert Smith. The Army estimated it would take 6 months to clear the backlog. That was their best case scenario. And that's when they decided to send in the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, the only all-black, all-female unit deployed overseas in World War II. Let me be clear about what they were walking into. These warehouses weren't clean, organized postal facilities. The buildings were unheated. This is England in winter. The windows were blacked out because of air raid protocols, so the lighting was terrible. Rats were everywhere, feasting on spoiled food packages that had been sitting there for years. The letters were mildewed. The whole operation was rotting. And the Army looked at this mess and said, "Here you go, ladies, fix this." It was disrespect disguised as a mission. They gave these women a job designed to break them. The woman leading them was Major Charity Adams, 26 years old, first black woman ever commissioned as an officer in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps back in 1942. By the time she took command of the 6,888th, she was one of the highest-ranking black women in the entire military. She had fought for this deployment. Black women had been excluded from overseas service entirely until late 1944. It took Mary McLeod Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt lobbying the White House to even make this possible. And when Major Adams got her orders, she knew exactly what this was: a test. The military wanted to see these women fail so they could justify keeping black women out of important roles forever. So here's what Major Adams did. She organized her battalion into 3 8-hour shifts that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No breaks, no days off. Each shift had a quota, 65,000 pieces of mail processed every single shift. That's 195,000 pieces per day. To make this work, they had to invent a whole new system. They created 7 million individual locator cards. Each card tracked a service member by serial number because names were useless when you had 7,500 Robert Smiths. They cross-referenced transfers, reassignments, casualties. They tracked men who had moved through 5 different units in 3 different countries. This wasn't just sorting mail. This was building a database from scratch, by hand, in freezing warehouses with rats running past their feet. And they did this while living under segregation. The white American soldiers in Birmingham didn't want them there. The military housed them separately, fed them separately. The local Red Cross even tried to segregate them into a separate hotel in London. Major Adams shut that down. She told them over her dead body would any member of her unit stay in that hotel. They boycotted. The Red Cross backed down. But that's the environment they were working in. They weren't just fighting the mail backlog. They were fighting the whole system trying to humiliate them. There's a moment that tells you everything you need to know about how the Army saw these women. A general, not even in their chain of command, shows up to inspect the operation. He sees these black women running this massive mission and decides they must be doing it wrong. He tells Major Adams he's going to send one of his officers to tell them how to do it right. And Major Adams, 26 years old, looked this general in the face and said, "Sir, over my dead body, sir." She refused to let him interfere. And you know what happened? Nothing. Because she was right. Her system worked. And deep down, even that general knew it. This is exactly the kind of story that changes how you see history. By the way, if you want more hidden stories like this, subscribe to Black Stories Untold. Now, back to what happened in those warehouses. The 6,888th finished the job in 3 months, half the time the Army estimated. Let that sink in. The military's best guess was 6 months. These women cleared 17 million pieces of mail in 90 days. They didn't just meet the deadline, they demolished it. And then they proved it wasn't a fluke. In May 1945, right after Germany surrendered, the Army sent them to Rouen, France, another massive backlog. Mail that had been sitting for years. They cleared it by October. Then they moved to Paris and kept working until February 1946. Everywhere they went, they took an impossible disaster and turned it into a working system. They did this in 3 countries. Every single time, they succeeded where others had failed. But here's where the disrespect gets even deeper. On July 8, 1945, while the battalion was in Rouen, 3 of their members were killed in a vehicle accident. Private First Class Mary Bankston, Private Mary Jewel Barlow, Sergeant Dolores Mercedes Brown, who died 5 days after the crash. These women are buried at Normandy American Cemetery. 3 of only 4 women laid to rest among more than 9,000 men. They gave their lives in service. And back home, nobody knew their names. Nobody knew the unit existed. The military kept this whole operation quiet. When the 6,888th returned to the United States in February and March of 1946, there was no parade, no ceremony, no public recognition. They were disbanded at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and sent home like it never happened. White male units that did far less got ticker tape parades and medals and their pictures in the papers. These women cleared a crisis that threatened military morale across an entire theater of war, and the Army sent them home in silence. Why? Because their success was an embarrassment. It exposed the lie that Black women couldn't handle complex, high-pressure work. It proved the military had failed where these women succeeded. And the easiest way to handle that embarrassment was to bury the story. For 35 years, almost nobody outside their families knew what the 6,888th had done. Major Charity Adams went on to earn a master's degree in psychology from Ohio State University. She became a college administrator and civil rights advocate. In 1989, she published a memoir called One Woman's Army. That's when some people started learning the story. In 1996, the Smithsonian honored her. In 2009, some battalion members were honored at the Women in Military Service for America Memorial, and a few got to meet President Obama. But these were small moments, quiet recognition, nothing close to what they deserved. It wasn't until 2019 that a documentary brought the story to wider attention. That led to a campaign for the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can award. In 2022, the legislation finally passed. 77 years after their mission. 77 years. By that time, most of the women were gone. As of early 2022, only 6 members of the 6,888th were still alive. Lena King died in January 2024 at age 100. Anna Mae Robertson died in May 2025 at age 101, just after receiving her medal. As of now, only 2 members are confirmed to still be living. Fannie McClendon is one of them. They waited almost 8 decades to receive the recognition they earned in 1945. Most of their sisters never saw it at all. And here's what makes this even more painful. In 2023, the Army renamed Fort Lee in Virginia. It's now called Fort Gregg Adams in honor of Major Charity Adams, a military base named after a Black woman who had to fight her own military just to be respected while she saved their operation. The same institution that silenced her for 70 years now uses her name. That should feel like progress, but it also feels like the military trying to clean up a debt they can never repay. Now let me show you why this story is bigger than one battalion. The 6,888th wasn't just a unit that succeeded, they were a blueprint. They showed that Black women could outwork, outthink, and outperform anyone when given a mission. They proved that the so-called impossible was only impossible because the military refused to use the talent they had. And that terrified the people in power. Because if black women could do this in 1945, what excuse did the military have for keeping them out of leadership roles?
What excuse did the government have for segregation? What excuse did white America have for treating black women like they were only good for domestic work? The 6,888th didn't just clear mail, they cleared every lie about black women's capabilities. And the only way to protect those lies was to erase the story. This is the pattern. This is how the system works. When black people succeed in ways that challenge the racial hierarchy, the response isn't celebration. It's silence. It's erasure. It's waiting until almost everyone is dead before you give them a medal and act like you always honored them. The 6,888th returned home in 1946 to a country that still wouldn't let them vote in half the states, that still segregated them in restaurants and schools and buses, that still told them they were less than. And the military that had just watched them save a collapsing operation stayed quiet, because admitting what these women did would mean admitting the whole system was built on a lie. Think about the exponential impact of this silence. Every young black girl who could have grown up knowing that her grandmothers cleared 17 million pieces of mail in 90 days. Every black woman who could have pointed to the 6,888th when someone told her she wasn't cut out for leadership. Every history class that could have taught this as an example of excellence under pressure. All of that was stolen, not just from the women of the 6,888th, but from every generation that came after them. That's what erasure does. It doesn't just hide one story, it breaks the chain. It robs people of proof that they come from greatness. And let's be clear about what the military lost by burying this story. The 6,888th created a locator system that worked. 7 million cards tracking personnel across a chaotic war zone. That innovation could have been studied, taught, expanded. Major Charity Adams' leadership model, running 3 shifts under impossible conditions with no resources, that should be taught at every military academy. But instead of learning from these women, the institution ignored them. Because learning from them would mean admitting they were wrong. And systems built on racial hierarchy would rather fail than admit black women were right. The 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion did the impossible, and the reward was silence. They were handed a rotting disaster and told to fix it in 6 months. They finished in 3. They worked 24/7 in freezing warehouses with rats and mildew and terrible lighting. They built a system from nothing. They did it in 3 countries. And when they came home, the country looked the other way for 77 years. That gap between what they achieved and how they were treated is the blueprint for how America has always dealt with black excellence. Celebrated only when the people who did it are no longer around to demand what they're owed.